welcome to the Fundamentals of Lute Playing. My name is Laudon Schuett, and today we're going to be talking about one of the most common dance forms you're going to run into in your Renaissance music. This is called the pavin or pavane or pavana. There's several pronunciations, and that's one of my little, I guess, things that I try to get across. People always, oh, isn't it pavan or isn't it, this or that? There are several pronunciations. I tend to use the old, not old English, but the 16th century English pavin as my pronunciation. Some people prefer to say pavan. But I wanted to start doing some videos talking about certain dance forms. We'll also talk about grounds. We'll talk about fantasies and ricercars and entabulations and things like that. Just some sort of a broad overview to give you some knowledge to start off your research on pieces. Obviously, if you're working on a specific pavin from a specific period, maybe you're doing an English pavin from the 1590s, you may want to look up some descriptions of pavins being danced in the 1590s in England to have as much information as you possibly can have. But this will just kind of get you started. So the pavin or pavan was a processional dance, and all that meant was that it was usually used to open like a courtly dance or a courtly function or a ball. Its origins were likely Italy, and then it probably traveled through Spain and then France and then eventually reached England. Of course, it could have, gone by boat to England sooner, but there's a sort of idea that it likely made its way in terms of popularity west across the continent. It is not necessarily a fast dance. We'll talk a little bit more of the character of it. The idea was that everyone would kind of line up and a chance to show off what they were wearing. If you think about it, it's the opening, right? Everybody has a chance to see, oh, what is she wearing? What is he wearing? Who's partnered with who, or who's standing next to who? And I'm going to include some links in the descriptions to some demonstrations of the dance. Now, one thing I have to get off my chest a little bit about Renaissance dances in general is in the past, I'd say 40 years now, the knowledge and recreation of Baroque dances, things from the 17th century and 18th century, has exploded. And I think we're seeing some pretty high level Baroque dancing out there, probably not as high level as it actually was in the time, but really, really fantastic Baroque dancing. And I think part of the reason for that is there are better treatises, better descriptions. There's a more sort of codified notation system for dance that appears in the 17th century. And then there's a need for dance with opera. So there are jobs for people. With Renaissance dance, and unfortunately, I think, if you look up or you follow the links I give you, or if you do a little more looking, you're going to see some pretty basic dancing. So you kind of go, oh, this is really, okay, this is very simple. And that'll be true even for more virtuosic dances like the Galliard. You look at it and you compare it to a courant or a sarabande from the 17th century, and you go, oh, the Renaissance dances aren't that interesting. Well, part of it is I don't think we've done a good job yet, or we may not be able to do a good job of recreating 16th century dances. The notation systems and treatises aren't as detailed. We don't have opera as this big sort of bringing professional dancers in. It's sort of done out of love, so there isn't the money factor. But we have descriptions of things like galliards where young couples were throwing each other's in the air. In fact, there's a subcategory of the galliard called the volta, where you're literally lifted into the air. So we know that the dancing reached a very high level in the 16th century. But I just want to say that when you see these videos, I want you to understand that these are the very basic steps. I think the pavin, even towards the end of the 16th century, if I remember correctly, they started adding more subtle and complex moves to it. It was never the virtuosic dance, but it was, I think, perhaps more complex than what we've recreated. So I got that off of my chest. There'll be some links in the description so you can actually see some people doing some basic dance steps. Now, a couple other things. Now, getting into specifically the lute and how do we approach pavans. Now, a very common question I hear from students is, well, how fast is it? And I think there's a good general answer to that, but we have to be careful. And the general answer is that it's stately. Most pavans are stately. But if we take, for example, a dance that's closer to our lives, maybe everyone watching this has had a chance to dance a waltz. We all know that there are fast waltzes and there are slow waltzes and there are sad waltzes and there are happy waltzes. You have to be really, really careful about going, oh, well, the pavin needs to be 80 BPM. And then you might take a lively pavin, something like an early Dolce pavin, and play it way too slow. When if you have a chance to play through the music, clearly this is much more energetic. You've got this livelier thing, but you compare that from the same source. So we look at Dolce. That is a pavin that was sort of a Venetian style pavin, and then he also includes some from Ferrara, and so you have this. And you might say, oh, well, but Laudon, you could play that lively. Well, let's see if I did it a little livelier. And I think, yeah, you could. And we have to open our minds to the idea that maybe that night the band was in a livelier mood. Or maybe the ball was celebrating a wedding and people just played it a little, or maybe the space was a little more dry and so the musicians felt that they needed to play a little faster. Or if the space is really resonant, then they might need to do something a little slower. I don't think we need to be stuck with this idea that there is one right way to play a dance. I think there's a range. I certainly understand how sometimes we get to this place. We're trying to be historically accurate. We're trying to be informed. So we're looking things up and we read a quote that says, well, the pavin was a stately dance. Well, compared to the Galliard, absolutely. Compared to a jig, absolutely. Compared to the volta, absolutely. But within that sort of general statement of stately, I think there's quite a range. And even within the same piece, especially when you get to later dances, something like a Ferrabosco pavin might open with something much slower or a little bit more, I don't want to say lugubrious, but stately. You might do something like... And then by the next, several sections down, you may be going along and going... You could change the tempo and play around with it a lot. And that's really, really common to see the affect or the character of the piece play from section to section, especially as the pavins get bigger and more complex. And I think that is something that happens in general with dances over time, is you'll notice that in the early 16th century, the dances tend to be short and tend to be unified in their affect. They tend to be lively or sad, with some variation in there. I don't want to say anything to say, oh, don't look for variety, but it does tend to be a little more consistent and shorter at the beginning of the 16th century. And as the 16th century goes on, the dances are expanded, ornamentation is added. The pavin, for example, ends up being very much a 3-section dance by the end of the 16th century. You have an A section, a B section, and a C section with primes. Earlier in the century, it's much more loose and varied depending on the source you're looking at. So just something to keep in mind, those characteristics change. let's see, what else did I want to cover in here? I think the other element, which I'll get into in more detail in a video on rubato. Rubato just being the art of sort of playing with time and borrowing time from certain notes. There is a tendency, especially for those of us with a classical music background, and I do think that a lot of the early music community comes from the classical music background. I think there's a tendency to use perhaps more rubato than I think they probably did in the 16th century. Now, at all, we don't know, but clearly, even though these lute dances weren't necessarily all danced to, some of them were probably just listened to. I do feel like the character of the dance and the ability to dance to it if you wanted to should still kind of be there. So sometimes I hear even really great players today really stretching time a lot. And I suspect that part of that comes from sitting and practicing in a room alone. And maybe if they spent some time with some dancers and played their pieces and had the dancer dance to it, they go, oh, okay, well, I can't get away with that and I can't do that. And this is perhaps a little more on the taste scale of things. You might say, well, Laudon, I think that's really beautiful. And there are some sources that say that you can use rubato. Of course, you can use rubato. I think it's the amount. So what I would say is that if you are playing a dance, I would try to keep a fairly steady pulse. That's my preference, which of course you can go against. I don't want to force anybody to play the music that I would, but I do think that there are other places to really play with time. Things like toccatas. There are sort of free sections in certain parts of fantasies and certain ricercars and things like that. And I think that allows you to get that rubato out. The dances, I think they lose something, especially to the average listener, if you play with time too much. If you are a lute player that's heard the lacrime pavin 100 times, it can be really, really, really interesting and exciting if somebody, sort of does a lot of dramatic rubato and playing with time. But I do think that it can alienate the people who haven't heard it. It's a dance. We need to get that across. We need to do that. So we have to remember as players that maybe we've heard the piece 100, 200 times, but there are people who haven't. And that character of the dance can be very special, and it adds a lot. And we can just get kind of jaded from playing the piece over and over again. I don't think I played the lacrime pavin, I don't know, 12, 13 years ago, like a bajillion times. I could never play that piece again. Some days I'm just like, I don't want to do it ever again. But for some people, they've never heard it, and it's just this incredibly magical thing to hear it. And I think part of your job as an interpreter is to get across the quality of the dance. And that's going to be true for galliards, that's going to be true for jigs, that's going to be true for courants, the subcategory of galliards, which is the volta. So, a couple of key points here. The pavin is a processional dance, which in general we can consider sort of stately, but within that there's a lot of different character. A lot of different affects that you can play around with. In general, as we go across the 16th century, the pavin becomes more complicated, more bogged down. I don't want to say bogged down, but more ornamented. It becomes kind of a bigger, more important piece. You'll look at pavins by Dolan, by Holborn, by Peter Phillips, by Allison, and things like that. And they're big 3 sections with ornamented versions of the sections, huge pieces. You compare that to Dalza and his pavins. They're short, beautiful little pieces. There's variety even from city to city. And when you're playing, I think what you need to do is, within that sort of general understanding of it being a stately piece, is to figure out what is the character of the pavin that I am playing. Am I doing a sad, or perhaps, even from about the same time period, if I were to take, let's see if I can, like a quadro pavin, which uses a ground, which we'll talk about later. That this has a very different character. And that is a Richard Allison quadro pavin, and I've seen versions of this as well that are actually double speed. This one ends up being quite stretched out with a lot of ornamentation, so you have to sort of figure out a happy medium. But the key can give you some clues. Is it in a major key? What about the title? One really interesting pavin by John Johnson, A Pavin to Delight, opens. Its A section is pretty lugubrious. It's pretty sad, and you get to the B section, and it's quite energetic with these sort of trumpet calls and things like that. So be prepared to look at the music and really think about, well, what character is the music telling me? And don't be afraid just because somebody said, oh, a pavin is stately. Well, don't be afraid to make it very sad, or don't be afraid to make it bombastic when it needs to be. There are going to be those moments. So that's going to be a general theme when talking about all of these dances. I'll do a video on the Galliard, and I'll do one which will include the Volta, and then we'll talk about jigs, which have some interesting things, saltarellos and other dances. But I think the general theme is that you do need to use your musical sensibilities. You have to play the music and find out, well, what is the character, what is the affect, and not just base your entire performance off of a single line from Morley describing it as a stately dance that people did. It's much more complicated than that, and so don't be afraid to look at a phrase and really try to figure out, okay, well, let's try this lugubriously. Okay, now let's try it energetic. And figure out what works. Play through the entire piece, and keep in mind that while I think it's important to have a steady beat, that doesn't mean that we don't slow down a little bit from one section to the next, or that maybe, we get a lot of ornamentation and we need to slow down the beat a little bit. I think that's perfectly reasonable. But if you're adding whole beats or taking away whole beats, that can be very disconcerting to a dancer. So I would find a happy medium. One way to do that is, I'm not a big fan of metronomes, but sitting and counting out loud, you can do something like 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And make your way through playing and counting out loud. That allows you a little bit of give and take, but it also has a pulse that the audience or a dancer, if you're working with a dancer, can actually follow. So I hope you find this video helpful. If you have any questions or comments, please put it in the comment section below. I'd be happy to answer. This is a big topic, and it's certainly not going to be a comprehensive video in any way, but just to sort of dip our toes in the water and talk about some general things to keep in mind when you're looking at, in particular, the pavins that you're playing. Happy practicing, happy luting, and look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye.